Greetings, this is a coronavirus update for 3/29/2020. What China did, what South Korea did, and what the hellhole known as New York City needs to do now. South Korea from late February until the beginning of March was the top epicenter of COVID-19 in the world outside of Wuhan, China. You can see this orange line here. I made this graph. It stands out pretty good, but I didn't assign the colors. But you could see that South Korea was the first country to jump over 1,000 cases, the first one to reach 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, all the way up to, crossing 6,000, and the first to reach 7,000. And it looked like everybody in South Korea would die, the way this curve is going, way ahead of other countries. And the U.S. was pretty much flat, the dark blue line on the bottom. This graph shows what has happened since the beginning of March in just 3 weeks. 3 weeks. In South Korea and in the U.S., mostly due to New York City, you can see the orange line now is just about flat. No new cases. Well, they have some new cases every day, but very few. They had as little as like 47 cases recently, and a lot of people are getting cured. And the USA is just increasing at an astronomical rate. This is like a geometric increase. It might even be an exponential increase. That blue line, dark blue line, is just really, really steep. It's going up at a crazy rate. So the WHO published a genome of the new coronavirus, then called 2019 nCoV, in early January. So you can see shortly after the publication of the genome in January, German researchers announced they had designed a diagnostic test. Then within days, scientists at the CDC said they developed one too, and even used it to detect the first U.S. case. Well, congratulations, CDC. You developed a test. But you knew that you didn't have the capacity to develop enough tests to test more than 1,000 Americans, and you screwed up the first test and had to recall them, and then we had no tests. So this genome information is on the right. So you can see it's a very small part of the DNA that differentiates this coronavirus from other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS and stuff like that. So the idea is to take that genome information, DNA information, and detect it. Detect the areas, detect the rings that are different, to differentiate it from other coronaviruses. If you can make a test that identifies that this is a coronavirus, then that's your test kit. South Korea got busy and used artificial intelligence to help them develop a test that could detect the genetic information that differentiates this virus from less lethal coronaviruses. Now, when I watched this video, I was a little impressed because why? Because CNN said the CNN article and video made it sound like 3 weeks was a miracle. But then we'd found out since then that U.S. labs can make a test in a matter of days if they have the genetic info. They just weren't allowed to make the tests due to FDA regulations, that the CDC knew about. So the CDC made some tests, but they failed. They had to recall them. They had nothing else to send us. And they knew that the FDA was a roadblock between the United States getting some tests and the thousands of laboratories in this country that are capable of producing a test. The FDA, had regulations that would block that. And the CDC knew this. For decades, they knew this. So what did little South Korea do next? South Korea quickly mass-produced the test kits and invented in-car testing so that they could test 15,000 people a day. So they had enough test kits for all the hospitals. They had one hotspot, Daegu, which is a city in southeastern Korea. And then they had, random areas of popped up, cases. But they had enough test kits, they could test anyone. They could test people driving by in their car. Hey, you want to test? Just get in this line and drive by. We'll take a swab and scan your driver's license, and you'll have the results in a few hours. So they had enough test kits, they could test anyone. They could test people driving by in their car. Hey, you want to test? Just get in this line and drive by. We'll take a swab and scan your driver's license, and you'll have the results in a few hours. So South Korea reports 516 new cases, bringing the total to 5328. Even at this pandemic level of increases, they have enough tests now, and they're starting to use them, which is the key to stopping the virus. New York City, on the other hand, is a hellhole. Like I said, is limiting tests to hospitalized patients. New Jersey is setting up testing tents, but they're only for medical professionals and people with fevers. If you don't have a fever, you can't get a test. You can be a spreader. You can have the virus and be a spreader and not have any symptoms, but you can't get tested unless you have a fever. That's on the bottom right. And on the bottom left, you can see March 27th. This is from the New York City Health Department here. It says prioritize testing for hospital patients. There's not enough test kits, and we have to use them for people that are already in the hospital, so we can figure out which ones have just a flu, influenza, and which ones have coronavirus. So number one, this is the first recommendation, what New York City needs to do. I'm a federal government consultant, so I come up with recommendations sometimes. New York City needs to obtain as many test kits as possible from the WHO or Germany or South Korea or someone. Now, surely the FDA and the CDC wouldn't have any issue with New York City getting test kits from the WHO. Okay, the rest of the world is using them, the countries that didn't produce their own. And this German guy, this guy that owns this little German, firm, laboratory, he's speaking before Congress, telling them how he did it, how the U.S. coronavirus testing stalled, flawed tests. Yeah, the first batch of tests they sent out were garbage. Red tape and resistance to using the millions of tests produced by the WHO. Why would the CDC do that? Because they sit around and smoke crack all day. They put this country in the condition that it's in right now, the CDC. You can blame Trump, you can blame anybody you want. The CDC could have prevented this if they would have had some test kits, and if they would have foreseen a reason to mass produce test kits by the zillions. But they didn't see that. They thought, we're only going to get 10 cases. We don't need any more than 10 tests. Korea exports 51,000 antivirus kits to United Emirates, and here's the middle where this guy and his little German laboratory produced 1.4 million tests by the end of February for the World Health Organization. That was the end of February. That would have put the U.S. in really, really good shape if we would have known who in New York City and who in Seattle and who in L.A. was walking around with infections. 2, New York City needs to follow what South Korea did and set up in-car and walk-in testing in as many areas of the city as possible. If you have enough test kits, test everyone, not just people with a fever. The people with a fever aren't a sure thing because there's other sicknesses going around. They could just, have influenza. It's the people walking around with no symptoms, like children, who could be infected, that are giving coronavirus to their parents and, their friends. So here's, South Korea not only invented the drive-by, testing, they were the first country to set up tents like this for cars to drive through. And you can see these are all, pretty big tents, with the exception of the one on the upper left, which is not a drive-through. All the other ones are. And the ones on the lower right are huge. I think that's somewhere in the Seattle area in Washington. Number 3, New York City needs to follow what China did, and that's set up testing areas with the Army and other volunteers. China very early sent the Army in there, the Red Army, the People's Army. I'm sorry, not the Red Army, that's in Russia. The People's Liberation Army, all the medical people from there, doctors and nurses. It's unfortunate, this was one of China's really big boo-boos, is they sent them in there without the right protective gear, and thousands of them got infected. So first 1,700 and then 3,000 by a few weeks later, and a lot of them died. We had a lot of medical professionals die because they went in to Wuhan unprotected. So this is what the New York City needs to do: is get the National Guard, get the National Guard medical people. They've got some National Guard people there now, and they're setting up a makeshift hospital. We'll take a look at that later, but that's not near enough, and they're doing something other people could be doing. New York City hospitals are full, and many patients that should be in a hospital are not. New York has staffed one of 4 proposed hospitals with the National Guard. You can see on the right some of the National Guard people coming in and setting up cots. So they've got people there. They've got 4 locations, and they're on the map on the bottom. The one on the first center that's being set up is Javits Center there. And they have other locations, and the mayors even propose, hey, let's turn hotels into hospitals, and you really need to do that because your city is so infected now. It's just crazy. You have to put a stop to that. Number 4, New York City needs to get the other 3 makeshift hospital locations converted as soon as possible and then staff them. So there's the next one here is going to be SUNY, that's New York University, and temporary hospital beds on Long Island. So where is this on Long Island? Doesn't say. Oh, SUNY Old Westbury. And that's, pretty far out of the city. I don't know why they chose these locations. Javits Centers, they should have just put one across the Hudson in New Jersey there, like in Newark. Picked another location. There's a lot of convention centers in New York City. Westchester County, that's Connecticut, and that's good for them because, it's all part of the same metro area. Southwestern Connecticut, Eastern New Jersey, and New York is all considered the tri-state metro area, which is population 19 million. But these, the ones on Long Island are going to be hard to get to for a lot of people. 5, New York City needs to borrow a page from the Chinese playbook on staffing by sending medical professionals from other areas to New York City. So I didn't have any pictures of these medical professionals from other cities arriving in Wuhan because there were some pictures actually. I remember seeing them. They're standing behind these big banners waving, like they're getting ready to leave for Wuhan. But more recently, these things popped up on Baidu. And the first bunch of 6,500 nurses were returning back to their cities because Wuhan is clear now of coronavirus. It was the epicenter. Remember that? It was the big epicenter of the earth where all the infections were. And now it's clear, and they don't need these medical professionals anymore. So the right picture, upper right, is nurses from Tianjin all getting on a bus, and they're waving at the police. The police were saluting them. And this was kind of funny because the nurses said, "Are any of you single? Because you can come back with us." And then there's a special boarding pass with a heart that they made for all the nurses. And then the ladies in the red that are running off a plane, they're Guangdong province. They didn't say where. They're probably Guangzhou or Shenzhen or Guangdong. And then Shanghai on the right, this Shanghai, this Shanghai flight attendant is announcing, a special announcement to welcome all the nurses from Shanghai who are now going back home. New York City and other major outbreak cities anticipate a severe shortage of ventilators. This is a national problem, not just a New York City problem. So I don't understand this. I don't just do government consulting. I've been in the automotive business for, a few decades. New York's ventilator situation, the fight escalates between Cuomo and Trump. Tesla donates hundreds of ventilators to New York. New York Hospital is treating 2 patients on a device, intended for one. And now it looks like it's working out pretty good, actually. They just split the tubing. The motor, the actual pump inside is strong enough for 2 people. You have to figure it would be, unless you have 2 400-pound people. If you have 250-pound people, you would think it's designed to be that heavy duty. During World War II, numerous manufacturing plants were successfully repurposed to focus on the war effort. These plants and the men and ladies who worked there turned the country into a war machine. So this was, at the beginning of World War II, the United States had the 16th most powerful army in the world. They were nobody, but they did have a lot of manufacturing. And, a lot of these are airplanes for the Pacific Fighter, which is a Corsair. And you can see these are being assembled in a pretty large plant. And this happens to be near where I live. In Northeast Ohio, Firestone made the wings for the Super Corsair fighters and sent the wings to Goodyear. So basically from South Akron to East Akron, by truck a few blocks away, where the bodies were made and the aircraft was assembled. It's a great example of repurposing plants. The Super Corsair was a 3,000 horsepower Zero killer. It was known as Whistling Death. All the Corsairs were known as Whistling Death, but this Super Corsair produced by Goodyear was the most powerful one. Now, why did I pick something from World War II? Because it's relevant here. Similarly, ventilators should be 100% American made and sourced, so that plants can gear up for ventilator production at any time without depending on foreign sources. That's why we have no personal protection equipment, because we have firms like 3M and DuPont who are making masks in China. DuPont has a huge plant in Shanghai, and it supplied all of China with masks. And the plant isn't designed to supply China. It's designed to, supply the United States. But China just basically took over the plant and didn't send any. So, China can do that. This is like a war. It's a war against a virus, but it's like a war. So it's, we didn't have Corsairs made in, South America. We made them in the heartland of America. It's because it's a war. You don't want to make your military stuff in some other country. And you don't want to make your virus stuff in China, the epicenter of viruses, because what's going to happen? China's going to take over the factory. That's just insane. That's another thing. The CDC, what do you guys do? Do you sit around smoking crack all day? Do you ever come up for air and think? These are some of the dumbest people on earth. Ventilator manufacturers tend to be small firms or larger firms that manufacture ventilators in a limited number of production lines because they make other medical equipment. So there's companies like this that are local. There's some really good-sized ones in Cleveland, but they're all over the country. So these are ventilators. You can see it's, a pretty small area. You're making kind of a small machine. And you can see that they have a housing and they have a screen, LCD screen, and then they have a bunch of tubes and some kind of pump. That's some of the components. Automotive manufacturers tend to be global firms with huge production lines and huge robotics that are focused on welding. So I don't know what Trump is thinking here. They're not well suited to be scaled down to make ventilators. I mean, these huge robots are just tack welding cars together. That's automotive manufacturers like Ford and GM are just parts assemblers. They don't make everything for a car. They put it together. They make the frame. They make the engine almost all the time, except for, there's some foreign companies that use, different engines, but, American cars use American engines. So the car manufacturer like Ford and GM, they make the engines, they make the frames, and they make the assembly lines. They're parts assemblers. So can you picture these giant robotic machines, working on a ventilator? But what? You got a welding head on it, but you have to reconfigure it so it can put a hose on a piece of plastic. I mean, I don't know, what the Trump administration is thinking here. This is just not a good idea. I mean, especially because there are much better ideas. So automotive suppliers would be better suited to make ventilators because they have smaller robotics and smaller assembly lines that are suited to make something small. Consider a plastic manufacturer or a hose manufacturer. So, I mean, take a look at the, plastics, all kinds of plastics companies, in the automotive business. So if the Trump administration would have said, hey, let's use Delphi and Visteon and a bunch of other plastic extrusion companies across the country, it would have made a lot of sense to the millions of people who are in the automotive business. So here's a ventilator on the right. It's a small thing with a bunch of hoses and plastic parts. So what do you see on the left? Do these automotive suppliers seem to be better suited to make ventilator parts than a big assembly line that has welding robotics that are the size of trucks? Yeah. They're better suited than, assembly plants like Ford and GM and Tesla. If you look at the left, you can see some of these big robotic machines. I mean, they're fitted with these heads for welding, and what do you have to spend millions of dollars refitting the robotics so that they can work on this tiny little thing that would fit inside of one of these cars. It just doesn't make sense that these assembly plants make. So in other words, the assembly plant is Ford and is GM, and everything that arrives there from suppliers are from, suppliers to the automotive market. And they can be very sophisticated too, with very sophisticated assembly lines and robotics, just smaller. So there are thousands of corporations, a lot of them that are suppliers to the automotive industry, that are sitting idle right now. It's a huge waste of production capacity. Could some of these make ventilator parts? Well, yeah, we just saw, hose manufacturers and plastics manufacturers. Number 6, the government should forget about automotive assembly plants. That's just too crazy, too crazy to use these big, huge robotics that are designed to weld on a little piece of plastic like this, and focus on finding manufacturing plants with smaller scale robotics that pump out ventilators by the thousands every week. So you can see the small robotics on the left. They're working on some kind of conveyor, and we don't see what the product is that they're moving around, but obviously it's got to be something flat because there's not much room between the robotic fixtures and the conveyor. So maybe they're tooling a base to something, drilling holes, to make the base of something. They could be easily making the base of a video display or the base of a ventilator here. Number 7, the government should acquire the patents to a few ventilator designs or acquire long-term licenses. So there's a lot of different ventilators made in the U.S. Just pick the best features of all of them, or, get the patents for some good ideas from some of them, and start producing a standardized ventilator, or maybe a couple of standardized. Well, you obviously need a couple because you need one that's battery operated to operate in tents outside of a hospital, and you need another one, for in the hospital room, and you might need a third one for multiple patients. So just get the licenses to manufacture these, standardize it, and make the same model all over the country. It's like, making the original Ford Model T, just make this, get a production line and make the same thing for everybody. Make it cheap, so everybody can afford it. Now I set some examples here, but I didn't cover all the parts of a ventilator because just to give you the idea. So this is an example. This is number 8. Have the parts mass produced by geographically dispersed firms, circuit boards by Silicon Valley and other firms, across the country. Maybe even Silicon Valley, maybe some circuit manufacturers there, circuit board manufacturers, can open plants in the United States that aren't, that don't have a circuit board manufacturer in that geographic area. But there's already a lot of places in the United States that are techie enough to produce circuit boards, and that's what I have here. So circuit board manufacturing, maybe have 10 locations just to make the circuit boards for these ventilators. And then here's an example for display manufacturing, 8 different locations to make displays. Medical tubing. Now, medical tubing manufacturers, don't just make tubing for, a ventilator. They also make tubing for the hospital. The way hospital rooms are set up now, if you go into a hospital room or if you've been in one lately, you see that the oxygen is just, fitted onto the wall. There's no big tanks in every room. And even in an operating room, they don't usually have tanks sitting around. They have, fixtures on the wall. So it's tubing that runs through the walls that, down to the wherever the big tanks of, medical gases are made. So, these medical tubing manufacturers, can produce medical tubing by the mile. So, and for a ventilator, you only need, a few short pieces. So, if you have 4 locations for medical tubing, that would probably be sufficient. And then assembly locations, I have this set up for small plants, like you see on the lower left, with small areas of robotics, and then also large plants where you can have just one assembly line dedicated to making ventilators. And then number 9, eventually you can build some new plants. Eventually assembly plants and suppliers will be geographically close to each other, maybe in the same city. Right now, there's no reason for a tubing manufacturer to be located next to a display manufacturer. It happens to be that way in a few cities in the United States, but, eventually you want to move to this number 9 where you actually have, everything together in one geographic area. You have plastic extrusion plants making the small plastic, pipes and things, and then you have tubing manufacturers. You have a humidifier manufacturer and a motor, a blower manufacturer. Then you have an assembly plant. You have displays. You have circuit boards. Put all those together in the same geographic area and then have like 20 of these geographic areas in the United States. So this is eventually something to move to. But right now, we can't do number 9 because you don't want to wait to build plants to make ventilators when we have plants that are sitting there with unused capacity. Number 10. Similarly, personal protection equipment should be made in the USA with no dependency on the virus capital of the world, China. Okay, right now, all of our Tyvek suits are made in China. They're made in Shanghai. Try to buy one. Try to buy a mask today. Why can't you buy a mask? Because China's got them all. So, this is just crazy. I put 40 locations here to manufacture personal protection equipment. Okay, this is your mask and your visor and your Tyvek suit. I didn't put gloves in here and booties, but same deal. Scatter them all over the country and don't ever make them abroad. So it might cost more to make personal protection equipment in the United States, but it isn't going to cost $2 trillion, which is what we're paying now because we don't have enough masks and we don't have enough ventilators and suits and test kits and stuff like that. We've got to start making this stuff in the United States. It's like World War II. We're at war. We can't depend on other countries. So we just have to stop doing that. So normally, I have a big woodworking shop in my basement, 700 square feet, and I have some masks down there, and I have some 3M N95 masks too. And I'm glad I don't have to buy them now because you can't buy them anywhere, But in my area, you don't really need to, nobody wears a mask yet. So anyways, all of this stuff needs to be manufactured in the United States. Instead of spending $20 for a box of 24 masks like I have, you might spend, $40. So what? Just get used to it. You're going to spend a little bit more because they're not made in China. And the labor in China is going up anyway. We shouldn't be making anything there anymore. We should be using Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia and Mexico. Similarly, all virus patient transport and care equipment should be produced domestically. Same deal here. Same deal as ventilators. And you can actually use existing, ambulance equipment and put a little tent on top of it. You don't have to manufacture a whole thing. And then, we saw this picture of this transport pod, virus pod on the left, and then the little robot that was attending to the first coronavirus patient in the United States. So the robot was, basically sitting there taking vitals all the time and sending them to nurses' stations, and they were talking to him using the display here. He wasn't being, he was only transported in this little pod. He had a regular hospital bed when he got to the hospital. But you got to wonder, how many of these things do we have? The CDC, one of their biggest issues, the reason that they're totally worthless is they didn't have any recommended inventories of anything like personal protection equipment. Somebody with a brain would have said every hospital has to have at least a 6-month supply of masks and gloves and Tyvek suits because a virus might happen. They've been happening. We're lucky this one's not killing as many people at a really big rate. But you got to wonder how many of these pods and how many robots we have in the country. I'd guess, a couple hundred. That's wouldn't do us any good today, would it? New York City has a severe shortage of treatments, drugs, in other words, for COVID-19. Now, the EU is right now running a massive clinical trials on drugs that were mandated by the WHO. So one of these drugs is remdesivir. So the EU, I read this article and I thought, I'm going to try to find this site. EU Clinical Trials Register. It's pretty easy to find, and it comes up right away to COVID-19. So if you take a look at this page and scroll down, you can see on the right we have 2 clinical trials going on for remdesivir right now, phase 3 in both trials. And the first one is for moderate cases of COVID-19, and the second one is for severe cases. So this is a good idea. This is a really, formal clinical trial going on, and the WHO provided a list of all the drugs that they would test. And remdesivir is one of the most promising drugs there is. That's the one that cured that first American. I mean, he was near death. He had pneumonia in one lung, and he had, tissue damage, and he was on a respirator, and he was breathing. But they gave him remdesivir. This is in another video of mine called Remdesivir, the miracle drug. So they gave it to him on the evening of day 7. And by day 8 in the afternoon, he was fine. He'd completely recovered, and there wasn't any sign of a pneumonia in his lung. And he recovered overnight basically. And then he only had a lingering cough like anybody would have after they've had some kind of influenza. So this is number 11. Remdesivir should be put on a fast track and given to all patients who have COVID-19. All critical patients, I mean, but were tested late and required a respirator because pneumonia developed or tissue damage developed. So anybody who had COVID-19 and has really severe issues now, like they're in the ICU, they should consider giving this drug to them now, because it's pretty well proven. Everybody attests to the fact that the drug is very effective. So there's another drug, American drug, that should be on this list that's not on this list. This is the drug that South Korea swears by. This is what they use to keep their death toll under 200. It's 152 right now. They've got 10,000 cases, only 152 people died. And you got to think that, probably all of these 152 people were elderly people with pre-existing conditions, and they had severe damage done to their body from the virus before they, gave them this other drug. And the other drug is called Kaletra. So Kaletra is a combination of 2 other drugs, lopinavir and ritonavir. And those 2 drugs were made by Abbott Laboratories. Now, Abbott Laboratories spun off this company, AbbVie Incorporated, and AbbVie makes Kaletra, and Kaletra has 2 drugs inside of it. So, South Korea swears by Kaletra, but But Kaletra was not included in this WHO list of drugs for this huge clinical trial because, why? Because it failed in a highly flawed clinical trial in China. So this is the article. This is from Fierce Pharma. AbbVie's HIV drug Kaletra stumbles in COVID-19 trial, but one analyst begs to differ. So I don't know who wrote this. It's not just one analyst. It's a few really highly renowned people who say, who beg to differ. So let's take a look at this. It wasn't just one analyst, like the headline says. These are people with bachelor's degree in journalism, as I like to put it. So there's an analyst named Umar Rafat who begs to disagree first. The patients had already been showing symptoms for about 2 weeks when they entered the study. That's very long. If you're showing symptoms for 2 weeks and you don't have influenza and you have coronavirus, you've got some damage done to you, because 2 weeks is enough for a virus to go crazy. That's very long, Rafat said, noting that Roche's flu drug, Tamiflu, needs to be initiated in less than 2 days from the onset of symptoms. So, you don't wait 2 weeks and take a drug and expect the drug to do any good. So that's what this guy says, and he's an analyst. He also said, honestly, I want to see a further subcut of this criteria, or this data. Perhaps for patients that initiated Kaletra less than 8 days from the symptom onset, or better yet, people who were tested positive for coronavirus and were given a drug as soon as they, had breathing issues. As soon as it was apparent that they weren't going to get over, a sickness like a mild influenza. In a separate editorial that ran alongside the study, infectious disease specialist Lindsay Baidu, director of clinical research at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and the New England Journal of Medicine editor-in-chief Eric Rubin also had something to say about this. So it isn't just one analyst. It's one highly regarded lady, and also the New England Journal of Medicine editor-in-chief. So these people know what they're talking about. Baden and Rubin pointed out the fact that the team chose a challenging population to study because the patients recruited were already late in the disease course and already had major tissue damage. That's not good. You can't, nothing reverses tissue damage. Even highly active antibacterial agents have limited efficacy in advanced bacterial pneumonia, they said. So, if it was pneumonia and it was caused by bacteria and not a virus, then, even highly effective drugs that are antibacterial drugs, they have limited capability of doing anything when you have, advanced pneumonia setting in already, and you have you have fluid in your lungs, and you have your cells in your lungs are deteriorating. Tissue damage is tissue damage. So these two experts say, that's a little crazy. That wasn't a good clinical trial. We don't know what would happen if they would have given these people, Kaletra at an earlier stage. So number 12, the FDA and the CDC and the NIAID. So this NIAID is a National Institute for something in infectious diseases, and the WHO should all consider a better clinical trial for Kaletra. It got left out very quickly before we have a shortage of remdesivir, and we have people dying because there's not enough remdesivir. Let's add another drug. South Korea swears by this. South Korea is the model country. They've done everything right. So listen to them. That's how they healed their people, using Kaletra. Number 13, New York City needs to follow what China and South Korea did, and that's disinfecting large swaths of the city. Not entire New York, but, highly traveled places, maybe from big residential areas to grocery stores, just go by with a truck and do what these guys did. You can see on the left, the pictures on the left are China, and this is Wuhan. And you can see Wuhan, these residential towers. Now, I lived in, a residential place like this in China. They have, like pretty high-rise residential towers, and in between you have little playgrounds and parks and stuff. And here's a truck going by, just disinfecting the whole city. You can see this big haze all over the whole city. It isn't just the truck that's going by now. They must have been driving back and forth in the same area for quite a while. So, and then on the bottom left, you have, what looks to be a fire truck, something big with a big, huge cannon of disinfectant on the back. And then you have guys walking by with these, handheld things, and, they're disinfecting streets and alleys and markets and stuff like that. And then there's a policeman there. This was kind of comical because he said in 3 different languages, he's first Mandarin, and then the second one, this was in Shanghai, so I don't know whether it's Shanghainese or whether it's Cantonese. There really wouldn't be a need to use Cantonese in Shanghai, but anyways, he's saying stay inside, put on your mask, no party. So he's just walking by a residential neighborhood with a megaphone saying that. And on the right you can see this is in Korea, and they had these army trucks going by a street, and you can see it looks like it rained behind the trucks because they're spraying down the streets. And on the right, you have the South Korean army walking by with these pumps on their backs and disinfecting, streets or walkways or something. So you got to get serious about disinfecting things. Now, I read about, high-rise residential towers and what they're doing. They're hiring people to come in and disinfect elevators and public areas and residential towers. But it's not being done across the city. So this is a little bit controversial. This is something that China and South Korea are both doing. They have smartphone apps that warn you to stay away from people who tested positive and stay away from places they have been. So if, on the left you have these are both South Korean apps, but I'm sure WeChat, I looked in WeChat, the Chinese app has a bunch of, apps that you can load in on WeChat and have it do the same thing. But anyway, you can see on the top left picture, you see a zigzag line in red, and that's where somebody with, COVID-19, somebody that tested positive, is walking around in the city. So you can avoid going where they go. You can see where the person is, where the person lives, and then you can, no, you can't. You can see where the person has been, though. You can see the person walking around. So, and on the right, basically the same thing. So they're using smartphone apps to stay away from people who tested positive and to stay away from places where they went, where they visited. Now, naturally, Germany's thinking about doing the same thing, but this, raises the issue of, privacy laws and stuff like that. They're not identifying the person, but, they're identifying where the person has been. So it wouldn't be very hard to find the person if you can see the cell phone of that person walking around a city. Eventually, they're going to go home. 14, New York could be using this information to disinfect areas where people have been. So maybe you just give this app to policemen or something, and they direct the street cleaners to go in these areas because a lot of traffic with people who tested positive for coronavirus. And maybe the store owners, just go to a store and say, hey, look, you've had, 20 people in here in the last week that had coronavirus, so you might want to disinfect. And food and grocery delivery people, if they're going to deliver to an address where somebody has coronavirus, they might want to just make sure they have a mask on and be careful. Just hand them a bag or a box. New York could take another play from the South Korean playbook and make quarantine kits. So when you have to put somebody in quarantine, now this, is valid in a lot of cities. New York would be one of them. But you have people coming in from ships and people landing at the 3 airports at New York, JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark. And sometimes they, are sick on the plane, so they come in and they put them in quarantine. But, South Korea made these quarantine kits, food, water, and masks. They're COVID-19 quarantine kits. And you can see there's other goodies in here like things to eat, toothbrushes, Like South Korea really has it together. So New York could do something like this, but it wouldn't affect that many people, just the people that are quarantined and not in their own home and don't have their own food and toothbrushes. Number 16. All governors and major city mayors should pressure the incompetent CDC, who knew that FDA regulations weren't going to allow the CDC to use private laboratory test kits, and the FDA and the NIAID to come up with a plan to allow thousands of U.S. labs to work on virus test kits. So the reason that they were able to get by with this now was the FDA wasn't, they have regulations that they have to go by. It just so happened that the CDC made a 3-part test kit. Part 1 and 2 was okay. Part 3 was flawed and made the test, virtually worthless, totally worthless. So the way they got by this regulation was the CDC had 2 working parts. So the FDA said, okay, you guys are only making part 3. That's not like you're making the whole test. It's not even half. So we'll let you make part 3 again, and we'll have valid tests. Now, the first time this was done, they relaxed the FDA basically relaxed the rules and let a lab in New York City do it first. Now, I've spent a lot of time in New York City. New York City is not exactly the epicenter of medical laboratories in the country. They have a few, but they're located all across the country. There's thousands of. Someday look up on. When I was doing a lot of research in grad schools, I would use the Research Centers Directory, which is something that costs you like $2,500 to buy 2 telephone book size books, volumes of fine print of all of the research institutes in the United States, and there are thousands of them. So there's thousands of research institutes based at hospitals and based in universities, and then there's private labs. All of these people could be making test kits if it wasn't for the FDA. So now we got by this time because of the Part 3 thing. But they got to look at, the CDC, like I said, they're brainless. They should have seen this a decade ago, that this was going to be an issue if we ever had a big virus outbreak in this country. How are we going to make test kits? You guys, you're the CDC, you're a little office in Atlanta. How the hell are you going to make, 100,000 test kits? You're not. There's no way you could ever do that. You struggled to make 1,000. So, you have to take advantage of your, research institutes here and laboratories and foreign laboratories. And in the case of Germany, we could have, bought the test kits directly from Germany. But this picture is just to show you that the FDA is kind of a roadblock between the CDC and it's kind of a roadblock between Americans and getting test kits from all these thousands of laboratories in the United States. So New York being the governor and the mayor of New York City, spends a significant amount of time blaming everyone else for an embarrassing and dangerous level of infection. But, anyone could have done a better job than the mayor and the governor. Just enforce things. You see other countries that are taking the lead. All you have to do is copy them. They're the pioneers, China and South Korea, 2 countries that really have it together and have coronavirus contained. They're the only 2 countries on the planet that have this contained right now. So all you have to do is watch and learn. And, you wouldn't go from this is just the last few days. March 23rd, New York, the state of New York went from 20,000 or 21,000 to 38,000 on the 26th to 52,000, and I didn't check today's. But, this is just crazy. It's out of control, and you can't blame everyone else. You can't blame the Trump administration. You can blame the CDC, That was established after World War II, and it's, people have been learning how to smoke crack there and not doing anything about inventory levels. They don't know anything about the business world, not enough about the business world. Then, maybe the world expected USA to be the leader, and, it kind of looked like that at the beginning. It kind of looked like, the way we treated the first patient. We had a test kit already, and we picked a patient up in a pod, a virus pod, and took him into a hospital room where a robot attended to him. So, it looked like we had it together, but we didn't, because the CDC was ill prepared for, a pandemic in the United States. It's like they never even thought of it before. They were prepared to test a few hundred people like we had with SARS and MERS. The United States had very little patients that were infected with SARS or MERS, the other, two other coronaviruses. So, we're not leaders. We're not even good followers. China and South Korea models seem to be the only way to contain COVID-19 from Forbes, from Bloomberg. South Korea wants to show the world how to tackle coronavirus because they didn't make any mistakes like China. They did everything right. They invented new things. South Korea's infection rate falls without citywide lockdowns. Nobody's locked down in South Korea. It's crazy. A couple days ago, they had only 47 new cases in the whole country. No country is like that right now. And, they had only 47 cases. Most of it is, groups of people from this crazy church that started all this stuff in South Korea. WHO to join Korea's clinical research team. They're not going to South Korea to help out. They're going to South Korea to learn, because South Korea did everything right. The Welt, which is, I spend a lot of time in Germany too, and I can half speak German, but this is a big German publication that I look at every day, the Welt, or the Spiegel, which is the Mirror. So politics abroad, what do they say here? The South Korean model, is it Germany's rescue? Yes, it is. Follow what they did and do the same thing, and you won't end up in the same position that the United States is in right now. Not only are we not the leaders, we can't even learn from the mistakes of other countries. We haven't learned anything yet. The only thing that we've learned is how to mess up. We're lucky that this was only a practice run. This isn't virus X. It isn't the one that's going to wipe out life on the planet because it has an 80% mortality rate. It isn't something that's worse than Ebola. It's something that's relatively mild with a low mortality rate, overall mortality rate. You can see here, even in elderly people, the graph on the left is from China and on the right is from South Korea. So, in China, 14.8% mortality rate with people over 80. That's not bad. But South Korea beat it, 8.23% with people over 80. So, if this was a killer virus, the population of the United States, you'd be looking for someplace else to live because the United States would no longer exist. Conclusion, we're lucky that this virus was not as deadly as some others. We're lucky it's not virus X. The U.S. is in critical condition due to lack of guidance from the CDC and lack of establishing critical inventory levels and, of virus-related equipment and supplies at all hospitals and hospital warehouses. But we can still recover if we get smart by obtaining millions of test kits that are available now and adding millions more by having other labs make a big supply, not just the few that are doing it now, and by making ventilators and personal protection equipment in the USA. Don't depend on the virus capital of the world to make our personal protection equipment because they'll hog it up and we won't have any. And by giving sufficient quantities of drugs to treat COVID-19. Remdesivir might not be enough. Kaletra would add another drug, and that would be really good. But we must act fast. We're not leaders in this fight. We're not even good followers. We need to get it together from now on. So I'll leave you with this. This is the BBC from about a week ago. Has America ever been this humbled? In 1 week, the U.S. has gone from being the world superpower to asking nurses to sew their own personal protection equipment, their own gowns and masks. Yes, every country's been stretched, but America is meant to be different, you know. It's the reluctance over the years to learn from other countries' healthcare systems. We might have the best hospitals in the world, and we probably do. One of the best hospitals in the world is, a mile away from me, Cleveland Clinic. And there's a reluctance over the years, to learn from other healthcare systems. We don't have the best system in the world. We might have the best hospitals and the best medical technology and the best doctors, but our medical system, look at it, it's in shambles. So, we're better off when a nation with the biggest economy and the biggest military in the world is healthy and strong and functioning well. It's scary to see the U.S. like this. This is coming from the BBC, and you can't argue with this. We look like idiots now. Let's stop looking like idiots and get it together and fight this thing and eliminate the virus like China has and like South Korea has. That's what we need to do. Okay, this is a little bit long of a video. Sorry, and appreciate your time.